The wind screamed across the frozen fields as the village of Eldenford prepared for another brutal night. Snow drifts smothered the roads, turning every path into a white maze. Inside a small hut, a young peasant named Aldrich rubbed his cracked hands together, desperate for warmth. His mother, Lena, wrapped in old wool, stared at their nearly empty woodpile. "We won't survive on this," she whispered, her breath fogging in the air. Aldrich nodded, knowing every villager faced the same harsh truth. Firewood was scarce, taken early in the season by wealthy lords or lost to storms. He stepped outside and felt the 30-degree wind bite straight through his clothes. The village elder, Bram, stood at the center of the square ringing a small iron bell. "Gather! Tonight we burn what our ancestors burned," Bram announced. Villagers emerged slowly, wrapped in rags and furs, each wearing fear on their faces. Aldrich joined them, shivering as Bram lifted a strange bundle from a sled. It wasn't wood. Everyone recognized the black, muddy shapes immediately. "Peat blocks," Bram said, "cut from the bog before it froze." Aldrich remembered the bog. Dark, foul-smelling, and dangerously deep. No one liked peat, but peat kept people alive when wood didn't exist. One villager muttered that burning the earth itself always felt cursed. Bram shook his head and said it burned hotter than anything they had left. The crowd watched as Bram broke a block in half, thick with frozen moss. Aldrich stepped forward, volunteering to help carry the heavy bundles home. As Aldrich lifted the peat blocks, he felt the cold slime seep through his gloves, weighing his arms down as he carried them. A small boy named Thomas followed closely behind, shivering but curious. "Does it really burn?" he asked through chattering teeth. Aldrich forced a smile and told him he would soon see for himself. They hauled the blocks back to Aldrich's hut, where Lena had already cleared the hearth. The room smelled of damp stone and old smoke. Aldrich knelt beside the fire pit, placed a peat block inside, and struck his flint until sparks finally caught. The blocks smouldered slowly, glowing with a deep orange light, filling the hut with a thick, earthy smell. Thomas stepped back, coughing, laughing that it smelled just like the bog, while Lena chuckled and said warmth mattered more than any smell. Aldrich added another block, watching the glow intensify as heat finally spread through the cold room. Outside, wolves howled from the frozen woods, their cries drifting closer through the night. Villagers bolted their doors, keeping out both the cold and the danger lurking in the dark. Bram walked from hut to hut, listening for the crackle of peat fires. When he reached Aldrich's door, he paused and nodded in quiet relief, whispering that with these flames, the village would survive one more night. But the night didn't stay quiet for long. Strange shifting noises drifted from the direction of the bog, deep and unsettling. At dawn, Aldrich woke to a low rumble shaking the frozen fields. Lena touched his shoulder, fear in her voice as she told him something was wrong. The rumble grew louder, like ice cracking under enormous weight. When Aldrich stepped outside, he saw dark smoke curling into the pale morning sky far beyond the village. The villagers gathered anxiously in the square, their breaths forming clouds in the icy air. Bram arrived breathlessly, announcing that something in the bog was burning. Aldrich frowned, insisting peat couldn't ignite on its own, but Bram's worried expression said otherwise. The villagers trudged toward the bog together, boots crunching through the snow as heat rolled toward them. A foul, suffocating smell clung to the air. At the bog's edge, the ground trembled beneath their feet. Cracks split across the frozen surface, glowing faintly from below. Aldrich instinctively pulled Thomas behind him as Bram knelt to touch the warm ground. Gas was trapped under the ice, Bram muttered, and it was catching fire. Before anyone could react, a pillar of flame burst upward like a fiery geyser. The villagers scrambled back in terror as more cracks ignited. Bram shouted for everyone to retreat at once, warning that the bog was waking in the worst possible way. The villagers hurried away as the bog growled and hissed behind them, sending waves of heat through the frozen landscape. Aldrich grabbed Lena's hand and pulled her through the deep snow while another explosion shook the trees nearby. Thomas stumbled as the ground vibrated, and Aldrich lifted him without hesitation, running toward the village as smoke swallowed the sky. By the time they reached Eldenford, the morning light had turned a sickly grey. Bram rang his bell again, calling everyone to the square. He warned that if the wind shifted, the bogfires would sweep straight toward their homes. Panic rippled through the crowd, people clutching children and blankets, not knowing where to go. Lena asked Aldrich what they should do, her voice barely steady. Bram pointed to the hill above the village, explaining that they had to move their fires uphill and gather whatever peat remained before the blaze consumed it. Aldrich realized it was their only chance. The villagers hesitated, afraid to return to the burning bog, until Aldrich stepped forward and volunteered to lead the way. Thomas reached for his sleeve, insisting he wanted to help, but Lena refused, pulling him back. With a small group behind him, Aldrich set out again toward the smoke-filled horizon, determined to secure enough fuel to keep Eldenford alive through the deadly cold. The heat intensified as they neared the bog, melting the snow beneath their boots and filling the air with thick smoke that stung their eyes. Flames crawled across the cracked ground, weaving through the dried peat like fiery veins. Aldrich wrapped a cloth over his mouth and shouted for everyone to grab as much peat as they could. The villagers worked quickly, lifting heavy blocks while the fire roared behind them. A sudden blast shook the ground and knocked several people down, but Aldrich pulled them back to their feet, urging them to keep moving. They loaded sleds with peat and dragged them away from the burning bog as it belched dark smoke like a living beast. When they reached the hill, Thomas ran down to help pull the sleds the rest of the way up. The villagers built new fire pits on the snowy slope, stacking the peat with shivering hands. One by one, they lit the blocks, and warm orange flames began to glow against the icy wind. Bram looked over the village from the hilltop, pride and exhaustion mixing in his eyes as he said they had survived another night because they used what the earth had offered. Aldrich sat beside Lena, watching the flames dance, while Thomas asked if the bog would ever stop burning. Aldrich stared at the distant smoke and said he didn't know, but whatever came next, they would face it together. And as the fires crackled against the frozen night, Eldenford held on through one more brutal winter. Subscribe to Sleepless Tales for more chilling stories, haunting mysteries, and endless nighttime adventures. Don't miss what comes next.